Imagine this. It's August of 1943, and a train pulls into the little Texas town of Hearne, population scarcely 10,000, carrying hundreds of German prisoners of war. These are battle-tested men from Rommel's Afrika Korps, veterans toughened by desert fighting, pressing their faces to the windows as they expect the worst. They have heard the whispers and rumors about American prison camps, stories of brutality, tales of torture, even grim rumors of execution squads waiting at remote facilities beyond the reach of Geneva Convention observers. What they did not anticipate was the heavy, humid Texas air that hits them first, the endless sweep of farmland in every direction, and American guards who appear almost casual. Camp Hearne was one among more than 500 POW installations dotted across the United States during the Second World War, yet it stood out for one overriding reason: its scale. By 1945, it would shelter nearly 5,000 German detainees, ranking among the largest prisoner complexes in the southwestern states. The compound occupied some 400 acres of former Cotton Belt Railroad property, its landscape punctuated by rows of whitewashed barracks, communal mess halls, a hospital wing, and even a chapel. Although the German officers arriving that summer had been briefed by Allied officials during their Atlantic crossing, the real thing still took their breath away. Yes, there were guard towers. Yes, there was barbed wire, but there were also baseball diamonds and a canteen vending Coca-Cola. The Americans didn't seem driven by a thirst for vengeance. Confusion set in almost immediately. Oberleutnant Heinrich Warner, a Luftwaffe flyer down over Tunisia, later recorded his impressions in a diary. The Americans' casual manner stunned him. Guards would sit and chat about baseball scores with prisoners. The camp commander explained work assignments in the tone of a factory foreman, rather than a prison warden. Rules existed and were enforced, certainly, but the overall atmosphere defied the image drilled into these men by German propaganda about Allied camps. One former schoolteacher, Otto Hilgenberg, remembered his very first meal: white bread, genuine butter, beef stew with real vegetables, and assumed it must be a ruse, some psychological ploy before worse conditions emerged. But an unplanned psychological shift occurred that first weekend. Saturday afternoon, September 4, 1943, to be precise. Guards announced that prisoners who had demonstrated good conduct could volunteer for a recreational outing downtown Hearne to witness an American cultural spectacle. About 50 Germans, mostly officers and encos, climbed aboard trucks under light escort, expecting a staged propaganda event or perhaps a war bond rally where they'd be displayed as vanquished FOs. They rode past farmhouses and cotton fields to a dusty fairground where a crowd had gathered around a fenced arena. Livestock pens lined one side. Men in oversized hats and snug pants leaned and smoked near bucking chutes. A brass band blared lively, non-military tunes. The Germans were seated in a roped-off section. American guards sat nearby, but their eyes were on the arena, not on the prisoners. A loudspeaker crackled. An announcer intoned the first event, and then pandemonium erupted. A gate flew open, and a 1,000-pound bull thundered into the ring, with a man clinging to its back, one hand gripping a rope while the other flailed. The crowd roared approval. The German onlookers sat stunned, trying to decode what kind of military exercise this could possibly be. Sergeant Fritz Haus, a tank commander from the 21st Panzer Division, leaned forward, squinting at the spectacle. The bull twisted and tossed dirt into the air as the rider jerked like a puppet, somehow remaining astride. 8 seconds later a buzzer sounded. 2 horsemen galloped in and scooped up the rider, who tumbled off and jogged away, hat raised to thunderous applause. Fritz whispered to his neighbor in German, "Cavalry maneuver? See how they extract the operative under simulated enemy fire?" His companion nodded. This explanation comfortably fitting the mindset of soldiers schooled to interpret everything through tactical utility. The next display reinforced that interpretation. A cowboy charged on horseback after a sprinting calf, whip cracking, rope spinning in a practiced arc. He let the lasso fly with perfect timing. The loop dropped over the calf's head. The horse braked. The rope snapped taut. and the rider dismounted seamlessly, sprinting to the struggling animal and tying it down in under 10 seconds. The crowd erupted. The Germans traded no-looks, reconnaissance and capture techniques, one officer muttered, producing a small notebook he'd been allowed to keep. Observe the synchronization between rider and mount. The horse instinctively keeps the rope taut without a command. Months of practice. Clearly, when bronc riding began, the Germans' military interpretations grew even more elaborate. Untamed horses bucked and spun while riders clung to a leather flank strap, one hand thrown skyward, not allowed to steady themselves by touching the animal or the rigging. To these observers, it resembled advanced cavalry, conditioning for chaotic combat scenarios. They are teaching soldiers to maintain composure when equipment fails or mounts panic under bombardment, Captain Werner Schultz conjectured. Several nearby prisoners nodded in agreement. It all fit their schema of organized martial training, only staged with a civilian audience for morale. Barrel racing perplexed them momentarily. Young women, actual civilians, sprinted horses through cloverleaf patterns around 3 barrels at breathless speed, leaning so far their stirrups nearly scraped dirt. One lieutenant theorized it as messenger training, rapid directional changes while holding speed under stress. Another posited it simulated evasive maneuvers on supply routes. That teenage girls performed these drills entirely flummoxed them, but they rationalized it as Americans mobilizing the whole population into war readiness, a civilian analog to Hitler Youth back home. Steer wrestling bulldogging, the announcer called it. Drew gasps. A cowboy leaned from a charging horse, seized a steer by the horns, planted his boots, and used leverage to topple the animal in a matter of seconds. Prisoners watched in genuine amazement. Anti-armor close combat tactics, someone suggested, training for physical grappling with enemy positions. The athleticism was indisputable, but to these men the purpose remained unmistakably military. This was covert preparation masked as public pageantry, designed to maintain operational secrecy while cultivating civilian support for specialized fighting units. What none of them yet understood was the central fact. These participants were not soldiers. They were ranchers, farmhands, oil workers, and wanderers who rode and roped for prize money, trophies, and reputation. The danger they courted was real, and their skill authentic, but their motive, the desire to compete, to win, to test themselves, was alien to a German military mind conditioned to collective purpose. The chasm separating the prisoners' assumptions from the reality of American culture was deeper than language or landscape. It was philosophical. Every German who saw that rodeo had been brought up in a society where leisure adhered to rigid structures, where physical risk required institutional sanction, and where public events served state goals. Voluntary danger as entertainment was a foreign notion. In Germany, athletic contests were organized through clubs with certification and oversight. Horsemanship belonged either to military cavalry programs or to aristocratic riding schools. The idea that ordinary people would assemble on a Saturday to watch others willingly risk serious injury for a modest cash purse and local acclaim simply did not compute. Oberleutnant Hans Weber, a celebrated flyer with 16 confirmed victories, tried to explain the rodeo to his comrades that night. The Americans have invented a decentralized training model, he proposed, sitting on his bunk while others gathered. Rather than formal military academies, they integrate combat skills into civilian life. Those men we saw are reservists keeping sharp through competitive events. Public cheering creates social pressure to excel, replacing the need for rigid military discipline. Several prisoners found this plausible. It explained cheering crowds, prizes, the absence of uniforms, strategic, even clever, they thought, a way to maintain a trained reserve without the expense of standing forces. But Ernst Frumgen, a university professor conscripted into the Wehrmacht at 42, was unconvinced. Ernst had studied American letters and culture. He'd read Steinbeck, remembered a Buffalo Bill poster he'd seen once in Berlin. He suggested something different. What if this is not military at all? He asked. What if Americans simply take pleasure in watching hazardous feats, the way we might go to a football game or a boxing match. The others regarded him as though he had proclaimed heresy. Enjoyment? Cowboys were getting hurt. One limped off after a bull stepped on his leg. Another bled after snapping headfirst into a rail. How could such injury be framed as entertainment rather than tragedy or military prep? This bewilderment exposed a profound contrast between totalitarian military culture and American individualism. In Nazi Germany, nearly every sphere of life was marshaled for collective ends. Youth groups trained for future service. Labor festivals reinforced productivity. Even arts and music supported state narratives. Acts of danger were justified only if they served collective benefit, defending the nation or executing orders. The rodeo embodied something else. Radical personal agency. Each cowboy chose to ride that bull of his own accord. No conscription, no court-martial for refusal. They could walk away whenever they wished. Yet they did not. The challenge itself, the personal test, carried meaning beyond external validation, something unfathomable to men raised to subordinate choice to national purpose. How could such a country prevail if its citizens prized personal glory over collective discipline? Yet here sat German soldiers, behind barbed wire, while these supposedly undisciplined cowboys roamed free. The cognitive dissonance was profound, and, for some prisoners, planted the first small seed of doubt about the narratives they'd been fed regarding American decadence and weakness. Camp Hearne operated under regulations that would have seemed remarkably lenient to anyone used to POW conditions in Europe or the Pacific. The 1929 Geneva Convention signed by both the United States and Germany required humane treatment, adequate nourishment and shelter, and permitted enlisted prisoners to work for wages while exempting officers from manual labor. The U.S. took these obligations seriously, partly out of genuine humanitarian conviction, but also out of pragmatism. Thousands of American soldiers were held in German camps, and reciprocity mattered. Thus Hearne became a curious hybrid, a prison in form, labor camp in function, strict in places, but surprisingly permissive in others. Daily life began with roll call at 6 each morning. Prisoners assembled by barracks while guards checked heads, then filed to mess halls that could seat 500 at a sitting. Many of the men admitted the food quality exceeded what they'd eaten during Rommel's later months in North Africa. When supply lines had collapsed, meat appeared several times a week. Fresh vegetables arrived when local farms could spare them, and working prisoners received roughly 2,800 calories a day to maintain health. The camp bakery, staffed by POWs who'd been bakers in civilian life, turned out fresh loaves and sometimes pastries for special occasions. Following breakfast, work details departed for nearby farms and ranches. Texas, by 1943, faced an acute labor shortage. Young men were overseas, and crops needed harvesting, timber needed cutting, and roads required maintenance. The War Department established a system allowing local employers to hire POW labor for 80 cents per day. Prisoners themselves received 80 cents in camp script to spend at the canteen. This was not charity, it was economic necessity. Absent that workforce, much of rural Texas economy would have stalled. German prisoners picked cotton alongside Mexican braceros and elderly hands, felled timber in East Texas pine stands, and repaired irrigation in brutal summer heat. Officers, protected from manual labor under Geneva rules, existed in a kind of suspended status. They could attend educational classes taught by fellow prisoners, ranging from English instruction to advanced mathematics. Some staged elaborate theater productions, building sets in the recreation hall. Others tended small gardens behind their barracks. The camp library held over 3,000 volumes, many in German, donated by church groups and the YMCA. Prisoners published a camp newspaper, Der Spiegel, written and printed entirely by detainees subject to American censorship. The intellectual life at Hearne would have been impressive for a small college, let alone a prisoner compound. Security was in place, but had a surprisingly informal feel compared to the harsh camps the men had imagined. Tower guards patrolled, and head counts happened throughout the day. But guards regularly conversed with English-speaking prisoners about baseball, weather, and hometowns. Escape attempts were rare. Where would a German speaker go in rural Texas without blending in? The few who tried were usually recaptured within 24 hours by local sheriffs and returned to camp. Punishment typically meant a few weeks of solitary confinement, not execution. Some later admitted they had attempted escape primarily to uphold military honor, knowing escape was unlikely, but feeling obliged to try. Weekends brought peculiar routines. Saturday afternoons offered movies in the recreation hall, mostly American westerns that took on fresh meaning after that first rodeo visit. Sunday mornings featured Catholic and Protestant services conducted by chaplains. Sunday afternoons were for sports, soccer matches between barracks teams, boxing exhibitions, and track meets. American guards sometimes joined in, producing surreal images of captors and captives volleying or playing baseball together, while war raged across continents. The second rodeo trip, on September 25, 1943, drew nearly 200 volunteers. Word had spread. Curiosity had flared. This time, the camp arranged extra trucks and expanded the German seating. The prisoners came with sharpened attention, many clutching notebooks to record details they believed revealed concealed military techniques. They watched the opening parade, cowboys galloping in formation, carrying American and Texas flags as the anthem played, and noted the pageantry with approval. Then the rodeo secretary, a woman in her 50s, wearing a white hat and turquoise jewelry, announced the evening's lineup over a crackling loudspeaker. Her casual authority baffled some. Why would a civilian woman coordinate what looked like military exercises? One prisoner conjectured she might be an undercover psychological operations officer. The bareback riding commenced. Unlike earlier saddle bronc events, these riders held only a leather rigging, no saddle, no stirrups, relying on core strength and balance against a bucking horse determined to shed its rider. Contestant number 7, gaunt, 19-year-old, drew a notorious mount called Widowmaker. At the chute's opening, Widowmaker leaped, landed stiff-legged, then twisted mid-air in a corkscrew motion that seemed to defy physics. Medical staff hurried over, but the cowboy waved them away, picked up his hat, and limped out, grinning despite clear pain. That image crystallized something for a number of prisoners. Werner Schultz, who had earlier been confident in his cavalry training theory, watched an injured rider slap hands with his buddies, and a seed of doubt took hold. Tie down roping a calf and securing its legs still looked tactical to many of the Germans. Speed, precision, and horse-rider coordination seemed to mirror military requirements. But the announcer declared the arena record, 7.2 seconds, from gate opening to tied calf, set by a rancher from Amarillo who'd never served in uniform. A rancher, a civilian. The announcer noted that the man raised a few hundred head and rode in rodeos for extra money and for the love of it. Sport, Ernst Frungen whispered to the man next to him. The word landed awkwardly at first, but then made sense. Bull riding remained the most bewildering spectacle. Bulls of 800 to 900 pounds spun and bucked violently, sometimes ramming the arena fence in attempts to free themselves. One bull, Tornado, had unseated 43 riders in a row, a statistic the announcer relayed with glee, as though the bull's record were a badge of honor rather than a training failure. Cowboys wagered on who could stay on for 8 seconds, 8 seconds for $75 and a flashy buckle. Not military endurance, not sustained discipline, just a fleeting, violent test for small rewards. The crowd's behavior provided further insight. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders eating popcorn. Elderly women in their Sunday dresses kept score on printed programs. Teenagers clutched hands and gasped together. This was not an audience judging tactical soundness. It was a community reveling in its culture. Slowly, the German detainees began to grasp that they had misinterpreted the whole affair. Their understanding broadened through conversations with guards and by correspondence. In late October 1943, Corporal Tommy Henderson from Fort Worth spent an entire afternoon explaining rodeo history to a hungry cluster of German officers. He spoke about the Old West cowboys driving herds to railheads in Kansas, the informal competitions that emerged among ranch hands during downtime, and how rodeo evolved into organized contests in the late 19th century, with Prescott, Arizona, hosting an early official contest in 1888. Henderson emphasized that rodeos had nothing to do with military preparation. They were celebrations of working cowboy culture and contests of skill against stock and the clock. Letters the prisoners penned home, all subject to American censorship, recorded their shifting impressions. Franz Burmeister, a corporal from Bavaria, wrote in November 1943, "The Americans have a curious amusement where men ride wild animals for money and glory. At first, we thought it was military training, but I have learned it is simply their custom. They seem to enjoy danger for its own sake, which explains much about how they fight." His letter was censored and sent, later recovered in German postal interceptions that historians would examine decades afterward. Another man, Ludwig Stein, wrote more introspectively, "These Texans possess a frontier spirit we've lost. They prize individual courage over collective obedience. I begin to see why they resist our new order so vehemently." Post-war interviews added texture to these accounts. A 1983 German television documentary tracked down former POWs who had been interned in the United States